So we've taken a look at various aspects of our application. We've even built them out. Now what we're going to do next is we're going to see how we're able to integrate our Liferay application into some of Liferay's different frameworks. Let's take a look at some of them. So what we want to do is we want to take our application and we're going to take a look at 3 different frameworks we're able to integrate our app with: the asset framework, the search framework, and workflow. So we'll hit each one of those. Let's go ahead. We're going to start with the asset framework. So when dealing with the asset framework, we're going to take a look at 4 different aspects, 4 different concepts of the asset framework. Let's start with the framework itself. Now, in the content course, or when we talk about content, we usually define an asset as sort of any different or any type of content integrated within Liferay. Now, more technically, the asset framework is a framework within Liferay that allows us to work with these different types of content in a uniform or unified way through the asset framework itself or through a standard API. So the framework allows us to do things like link one asset to another, or in other words, link one specific type of content to another one. It allows us to add common metadata using Liferay's tags and categories. If you are interested in content, we do have a full content course available for you as well. And the asset framework also allows for smooth integration with Liferay's search as well as Liferay's workflow engine. So what is an asset specifically? Again, the more generic definition is any sort of content that we create in Liferay and that's integrated within the asset framework. Now, more technically speaking, an asset is sort of an object that represents a specific model entity, right? This asset object, kind of an abstraction or an abstract representation of that model entity, and it's going to be integrated or used within the asset framework. In other words, it's kind of like a wrapper around our specific entity, which allows for us to do some common things amongst all of our different content types, such as add specific metadata like the title or the description or when it was created. With this asset object, we have a number of different applications in which we can display these assets. So what is the asset renderer? Well, we're going to have these abstract generic objects representing a specific entity. So if we have this asset, how do we know what the asset corresponds to? This is where the asset renderer is going to come into play. So I might have what looks like a generic asset type, but the asset renderer is going to let me know, hey, this specific asset corresponds to a wiki, or this specific asset corresponds to an assignment or a submission. So when we create these asset renderers, it's going to be a component that's going to implement that asset renderer, or a class that implements the asset renderer. So what is the asset renderer factory? The asset renderer factory follows the factory pattern. This is how we're going to be creating the asset renderer objects. So if we want an asset renderer, we're going to use the asset renderer factory to help us out with that. This is a way in which we're able to create multiple asset renderers. So altogether, we can have a number of different types of content, right? We can have a blog entry, maybe we upload a PDF. We can have our assignment that we have created. And all of these different things can be represented as an asset entity. The asset entry is going to have a common list of fields like class PK, title, description, when it was modified, when was it created. Now, since this is a generic object, we need something to be able to interpret what does this asset entry correspond with? This is the asset renderer. So for each content type, there will be an asset renderer that'll help us figure out what is this asset entry corresponding with. In order to create the asset renderer object, we're going to be using an asset renderer factory. Okay, so the asset renderer, as the name implies, kind of does just that. It's going to help us render the specific asset on our site page. Right? And then we have sort of this feedback. If we have, for example, the asset publisher on a page, it's displaying different types of asset. Right? If the asset publisher needs to know, hey, I need the asset for wikis, then we can use the asset renderer to help us out with that. All right, let's get all of the wiki assets, and boom, we'll display it on the asset publisher, for example. So what does this look like over in the database? If we open up two separate tables here, on the left we have the blogs entry, on the right we have our specific asset. You're going to see a couple of fields match up, right? On the left, right, you might see company ID, you might see group ID. So these are some of the common ones that we see. But for the asset entry, right, all of our assets are going to have these specific attributes. Right? On the left is specific to the blogs. On the right is for all of the different assets that we're going to be that are created within Liferay. Right? Another example here, taking a look at a specific blogs entry that is created. And so we'll see there are a couple of commonalities, a couple of common fields here, right? Like the entry ID. We also have, let's see what else, the company ID and the user ID. Right? So there are some that line up pretty well. We'll see, for example, the blogs entity ID or entry ID is different than the one below for the asset entry. Okay, so they correspond with each other, and for the most part we can see a lot of the info there is the same. So we have a pretty massive list of all of the different properties, all of the different fields that are within our asset. So if you want to feel free to read through all of these, feel free to do so. Hit that pause button, right? Because you got a lot. So a lot of information is going to be stored within our assets. Now, when we are working with the specific asset entry in the back end, we have services to help us out. Following the pattern that we know, local service for local, remote services, just remove the local part. So we have a local and remote service for our asset entries here. So why does this all matter? Why would we want to be integrated within Liferay's asset framework? Again, we have a lot of different reasons why. We at Liferay believe this is a really good idea to not only bring upon a good user experience, but to also be able to leverage a lot of the behind the scenes, a lot of the tools that we have here with Liferay. So let's highlight a couple of different ones. One of the most powerful applications in Liferay is the asset publisher. The asset publisher will display assets. So if we want to display our assignments, our submissions within the asset framework, we can do so. And the asset framework also allows for ADTs too. With that, we can also use tags and categories as a way to provide keywords or metadata in regards to our assignments and submissions. We got a couple other ones like comments and ratings, but we can integrate with Liferay Search, Liferay's workflow engine. We have some other data tracking for our assets. You can relate assets amongst one another, right? So you can create a direct link between one asset and another. And to keep this list a little bit short, we can also have the recycle bin, a way in which we can place something there and either retrieve it if we need it or have it deleted after X amount of days. So how do we integrate our application with the asset framework? We start off by adding the required fields, references, and finders for our model entity. So we have to do a little bit more with our assignments and submissions. From there, we're going to need a way to manage the asset resource or the asset entity. So this is going to be done within our CRUD methods. So whenever, for example, we are updating the info about our assignment, we also want to update the asset entity as well. As we have these asset entities, we need that interpreter to be able for Liferay to determine this asset here corresponds to the assignment entity. So we know this is done through an asset renderer, but in order to create the asset renderer, we need an asset renderer factory. So we'll create that asset renderer factory for, in our situation, our assignment and submissions. That asset renderer factory will then create the asset renderer object, and then we can then implement our JSPs so that we can actually display the specific entity we're integrating. So let's take a look at an example here. So we have a custom entity over in our service.xml. We first need to confirm that we have a number of fields, right? These are kind of the required fields that are needed in order for our asset entry to work. From there, we want to check to make sure our UUID attribute is set to true, and we're going to be adding a reference to the asset entity service. Basically, we want to call the asset entity service whenever something is going on with our entity. Okay, and then we're going to add a status finder method. So first part, right, adding those fields that we need, making sure that the UUID is set to true. So that's step one over here in service XML. On top of that, we make reference to the asset entry service, and then we're going to have the status finder method to get a collection of for the status. So step two here is managing our asset entry or asset resources. The idea here is whenever something happens to our model entity, we have the same thing happen with the asset entry. Create an assignment, asset entry is created along with it, right? Delete it, update it, you get the idea. So what that looks like, in this example here, we have the blogs entry and we have the add entry method. From there, assume all of the logic to make it happen. And then as we go down, we'll see the update asset method will be called right at the end of the add entry method that we have here. And then we can do the same thing with the delete. So when we delete our blog entry, for example, we'll also have the asset entry deleted as well. A little bit confusing, right? The names are so close. So whenever the blog entry is deleted, the asset entry will be deleted with it as well. So third step here, we need to create the asset renderer factory, bridging the gap between a generic asset and what it corresponds to. So that's done with the asset renderer. We use the asset renderer factory to create the asset renderer. So in this case, we see the asset renderer factory is created for the blog's portlet or for our blog entries. Right, so once we have the asset renderer factory all taken care of, we can then go ahead and create our asset renderer object. So last step here is we want our asset to be able to be displayed within the asset publisher. So we create two JSPs within our project, our own application. This JSP will display our asset as an abstract as well as in full content or full context. So with all of that, let's go ahead and work on an exercise of integrating our gradebook application into Liferay's asset framework. So we spent a lot of time talking about it. Let's go ahead and do it. We'll hit these steps here. So we're going to first start off by making sure our service.xml has all the fields that are needed. After that, we're going to double check our CRUD operations or methods and add the corresponding action that's going to be performed on the asset entry. So create an asset entry, delete it, update it, and so on, as the same thing occurs with our assignment entity. We'll then create the asset renderer factory, and in the process create the asset renderer, and then we will create the JSP files so that we can display our entity within the asset publisher. We'll then deploy and test it out. So let's head over to Liferay Developer Studio to test all of these things out.